The Lifeboat Launch. The sea in Trevore Cove that Tuesday morning was as smooth as poured oil, pale gray under a calm autumn sky, without enough swell to overturn a child's paper boat. 7 volunteer crewmen leaped clear of the slipway into 12 feet of water during their annual drill, their canvas life jackets buoyant on the surface like orange buoys, their laughter carrying clean across the rocks. 6 of them bobbed up instantly, treading water with easy practice strokes. The 7th man, a veteran fisherman who had swum these waters since boyhood, did not rise at all. He went down straight and heavy, as though a stone anchor had been padlocked to his ribs, because the cork blocks inside his canvas vest had been carved away in secret and replaced with dense, waterlogged elm, hollowed out and packed with 50 pounds of lead shot. The water had not killed him. A piece of carpentry, planned 3 weeks earlier on dry land, had done the work long before he ever touched the sea. Hello, and welcome to Midnight Pages. I'm David, your host, joining you tonight from Ohio. The story before us this evening is one that touches upon a very quiet, very dangerous corner of human nature. The way we place absolute faith in small-town institutions, and the terrible vulnerability of that trust when someone on the inside decides to turn a life-saving tool into an instrument of murder. It is a case of a tight-knit coastal community, an honorable tradition of volunteer rescue, and a single handwritten page in an ordinary maintenance ledger that held a lie so neat it almost went unnoticed forever. Before we step into the coastal chill of Trevore Point, let me ask you, have you ever trusted an institution or a pillar of your community completely, only to find that the appearance of virtue was being used as an impenetrable shield? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I read each one with great care, and tonight's mystery offers much to ponder about the things men do to preserve a false name. Now the tide is turning, and the station doors are open. Let us walk down to the slipway together. Chapter 1. The Volunteers' Last Dive. Trevore Point had always considered itself somewhat insulated from the restless cruelties of the wider world. Clinging to the jagged granite ribs of the southern Cornish coast, the village was comprised of 3 steep lanes of whitewashed slate cottages, a single grocer's shop that smelled eternally of smoked haddock and paraffin, an ancient stone church dedicated to St. Piran, whose graveyard leaned precariously toward the Atlantic, and the Royal National Lifeboat Station. To the 300 souls who lived there, the lifeboat station was not merely a municipal building or an auxiliary service, it was the sacred moral heart of the parish. For 84 years, the Trevore Point boat had answered the maroons in blinding westerly gales, plucking stranded Welsh colliers and French trawlers from the teeth of the Black Dog Shoals. Every family had a cousin, a brother, or an uncle who had pulled an oar or manned the diesel engine. The men who wore the dark blue jerseys and the yellow oilskins were regarded with the sort of unquestioning veneration that inland villages reserved for saints and titled squires. On Sunday mornings, when the crew walked into St. Piran's in their polished boots, the congregation parted instinctively to let them take the front pews beneath the carved oak rood screen. In Trevore Point, courage was not an occasional virtue. It was the ordinary coin with which every fisherman paid his rent to the Atlantic. The history of the cove was written in brass and granite. Upon the north wall of the church porch hung the wooden name-board of the city of Cadiz, a 4-masted bark that had broken her back on the outer shoals in the great blizzard of 1891, when 9 Trevore men had rowed an open pulling boat through 30-foot breakers to take 42 living souls from the rigging. 3 of the rescuers had died of exposure before dawn, and their names were carved into the altar rail alongside those of the parish war dead. In such a place, the lifeboat was not an organization. It was the very spirit of the community. It was a blood covenant between the living and the sea. Miss Judith Hartley had arrived in Trevore Point on the Friday preceding the tragedy, having taken the branch line train from St. Austell in response to a long-standing invitation from her dearest childhood friend, Mrs. Constance Vane. Constance, the widow of an archdeacon, and a woman whose passion for watercolor landscapes was exceeded only by her formidable memory for Cornish genealogies, inhabited a pleasant stone cottage, situated halfway up the western cliff. It was a comfortable perch from which to observe the comings and goings of the harbour, provided one had a sturdy pair of brass-mounted opera glasses, and a tolerance for the perpetual rattle of loose window sashes against the prevailing sea wind. "You will find it quiet here, Judith dear," Constance had remarked on that first evening, as they sat by a fragrant fire of driftwood and sea coal, working upon a pair of ribbed woolen bedsocks for the district nurse. "Very peaceful, though somewhat damp in the evenings. The only excitement we ever have is when Captain Ross calls an assembly for a practice launch. The whole village turns out on the headland to watch the slipway. It is quite a spectacle, really. Like a grand theatrical performance, but with all our own butcher's boys and postmen playing the heroes." Miss Hartley had smiled, her needles clicking with rhythmic, soothing precision. "One does admire them so very much, Constance. There is something truly noble about men who risk their lives for absolute strangers, without the expectation of a single shilling in payment. And yet, human nature being what it is, I have so often noticed in St. Mary Mead that where an enterprise is regarded as beyond reproach, people are sometimes inclined to overlook the small, ordinary frailties that exist underneath. My dear mother used to say that when a man puts on a uniform, whether it is an admiral's coat or a churchwarden's surplice, one must be twice as careful to remember that he remains a mortal creature, subject to envy, debts, and bad temper. We had a most respectable sidesman at St. Michael's, Prentice, who collected for the Missionary Society for 30 years with tears in his eyes. And yet when poor Mrs. Cleary's pig died, it was found that he had charged her 20% interest on a small loan for its replacement. Constance had laughed, dismissing the notion with a wave of her darning egg. "Not here, Judith. Our lifeboatmen are like lions. There is not a petty bone in their bodies." That innocent declaration was tested 4 mornings later, on a Tuesday of deceptive perfection and unusual stillness. The seagulls, which usually circled the cliff-tops in screaming battalions whenever a southwesterly storm was brewing off the Scillies, hung almost motionless upon the gentle thermals, their white wings catching the silver gleam of the dawn light. Along the steep, cobblestone incline of Slipway Lane, Mrs. Penhaligon had already set out her copper milk pails to dry on the slate bench, and old Isaac Trewin was mending a drift net on the granite pier, his horn shuttle clicking like a giant cricket against the tarred twine. The sea had receded to a glass-like sheet of pewter, the horizon veiled in a pearl-gray mist that promised an unseasonably warm afternoon. It was the sort of quiet, timeless Cornish morning when the world seems incapable of malice, when every garden wall smells of honeysuckle and wild thyme, and the sea looks like nothing more than a vast, harmless mirror laid out at the feet of the hills. At precisely 10 o'clock, the maroon sounded from the station roof, a sharp, concussive bang that sent the gulls wheeling in panic above the chimney-pots. It was the scheduled autumn drill, an annual exercise intended to test the slipway carriage, the winch machinery, and the rapid deployment of the crew in full sea gear. From the terrace of Highcliffe Cottage, Miss Hartley and Mrs. Vane had watched through the glasses as the great twin-screw vessel, painted in brilliant white and deep blue, slid down the greased timbers with a roaring splash that threw up twin wings of foam. The boat cleared the entrance of the cove and swung round into the deep channel. Then came the man-overboard drill. 7 men, clad in heavy guernseys, blue serge trousers, and the bulky, multi-paneled cork life vests mandated by the institution, leaped one after another from the gunwales into the quiet water. Through her glasses, Miss Hartley had observed the figures hit the surface. It was a routine maneuver they had executed 50 times before. The bright orange canvas collars snapped up under their chins, keeping their heads well clear of the brine, as they waved back to Captain Ross on the bridge. Except for one. Tom Pellegrew, a man of 38, with shoulders like an ox, and a constitution hardened by 20 years of trawling, struck the water feet first. He did not rise to the surface. He did not even bob upward to the level of his collarbones. There was a single, violent froth of white water, a desperate thrashing of two muscular arms that lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then his cap floated alone upon the calm surface. On the cliffs above, the cheers of the gathered villagers died away into an eerie, suffocating silence. A long, bewildered cry echoed from the deck of the lifeboat. Lines were thrown. 2 crewmen dived instantly into the gray depths, but by the time they brought Tom Pellegrew up from the seabed 12 feet below, his lips were blue and his chest was completely still. Dr. Penrose, the village surgeon, had knelt upon the wet boards of the jetty for 45 minutes, his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, performing artificial respiration, while Captain Ross stood over him with his sea cap clutched in white-knuckled fists. But there was no breath left in Tom Pellegrew. The sea had claimed him in the very spot where a child might have paddled a wooden dinghy. That evening, the village of Trevore Point sat behind drawn curtains, stunned into a state of bewildered mourning. The public house, the Lugger and Anchor, remained empty, the patrons speaking in hushed whispers on street corners before hurrying home. The prevailing opinion, voiced loudly by Constable Gidley and accepted with solemn nods by the vicar, was that poor Tom had suffered a catastrophic seizure, a massive cramp of the stomach, or a sudden, unsuspected failure of the heart, brought on by the sudden chill of the sea. Miss Hartley, however, had spent the late afternoon accompanying Constance on a visit of condolence to the stricken cottage at the head of the slipway lane. Martha Pellegrew, a pale, stoic woman with 3 small children clinging to her apron, sat in the small parlor where the clock ticked with agonizing slowness. "He was as strong as a bull, Miss Hartley," Martha had whispered, her eyes dry and red with exhaustion, her fingers knotting the hem of her coarse calico apron. "Never a day's sickness in his life. He swam across the bay for a wager only last August, from the Beacon Rock to the quay, carrying his boots on his shoulders. He said to me this morning, as he laced his sea boots by the stove, that he'd be home by noon to dig the winter parsnips, and that we'd have a bit of roast mutton on Sunday." She paused, her gaze wandering toward the corner dresser where her husband's tobacco jar sat beside an empty brass candlestick. "And he was worried about something, too," Martha continued, her voice trembling. "These last 3 weeks he hardly slept a full night. He would get up in the dark, light a candle at the table, and write things down in his little black oilcloth pocketbook, columns of numbers, dates, cross-references from the freight receipts. When I asked him what ailed him, he'd just shake his head and say, 'There's rot in the timber, Martha. Rotten timber where folks think there's solid oak. And if I don't speak up at the Michaelmas meeting, no one will. A man can't look his mates in the eye when there's deceit sitting in the captain's cabin.'" Miss Hartley leaned forward, her mild blue eyes resting attentively on the widow. "Did he say what kind of timber, Mrs. Pellegrew, or what meeting he meant?" "No, ma'am," Martha sighed. "He locked the little black book in his sea chest right there under the window. But when I went to look for it this afternoon, to give it to the constable along with his papers, it wasn't there. The brass padlock was hanging open, and the book was clean gone. Someone came into this house while I was down at the slipway weeping over his body, and took it." As Miss Hartley walked back up the cliff path beside Constance in the gathering dusk, the wind off the Atlantic carried the sharp, clean scent of salt and gorse. But underneath that coastal freshness, Miss Hartley felt the cold, unmistakable shadow of something calculated and sinister. A strong swimmer drowned in calm water, a missing notebook full of figures, and a good man silenced on the eve of an inquiry. It had the dreadful, familiar shape of human wickedness, and Miss Hartley knew with quiet certainty that the sea was entirely innocent of Tom Pellegrew's blood. Chapter 2. The Station Book. The Trevore Point lifeboat station sat low at the foot of the western cliffs, a fortress-like edifice of dark granite blocks roofed with heavy delaboal slate. Inside, the air was a rich, pungent distillation of linseed oil, cold seawater, Stockholm tar, paraffin, and seasoned ash. High up in the crossbeams of the roof, swallows had built their mud nests under the eaves, swooping down occasionally through the open seaward doors to skim the surface of the slipway before darting back into the shadows. The boathouse was an immense cathedral dedicated to human endurance, where every rope coil, every spare propeller blade, and every brass-bound boathook was kept in a state of immaculate, glistening readiness, inspected twice weekly by officers whose standards of cleanliness exceeded those of any hospital matron in the county. The great carriage dominated the central bay, holding the 40-foot motor lifeboat high above the concrete floor, its twin bronze propellers gleaming in the pale light that filtered through the arched seaward doors. Along the whitewashed walls hung coils of heavy manila hemp, brass diving helmets from an earlier era, emergency flares in sealed copper tins, and a double row of black rubber sea boots standing like silent sentinels beneath the peg rails. Upon the eastern wall, framed in dark English oak, hung the brass memorial tablets commemorating the great rescues of the past century. One plaque recorded the loss of the pulling lifeboat Constance in the storm of 1911. Another listed the names of the volunteer crewmen who had received the RNLI Silver Medal for gallantry. It was a room where every timber and iron fitting was hallowed by sacrifice. On Wednesday morning, Miss Hartley accompanied Mrs. Vane to the station under the guise of delivering a basket of freshly baked caraway seed cakes for the crew, a traditional gesture of comfort that permitted two elderly ladies to enter an exclusively masculine domain without exciting the smallest degree of suspicion. Captain Ross, the coxswain, sat on an overturned paraffin drum near the workbench, looking as though 10 years had been violently subtracted from his life in 24 hours. He was a broad-chested man of 60, with a face like weathered teak, eyes the color of winter gorse, and a voice that had barked commands over 30 years of Channel storms. "It doesn't make no kind of sense, Mrs. Vane," Ross was saying to Constance, his massive hands clasped between his knees. "Tom was like a fish in the sea. If you'd told me the slipway itself had turned upside down and floated off to France, I'd have believed it sooner than Tom Pellegrew, drowning in 12 feet of dead water on a flat tide. Constable Gidley talks about a seizure, but a man having a seizure kicks or turns on his back or groans. Tom went down like an anvil, straight down, heels first, without a flutter. When Frank Truscott brought him up from the shingle, he said Tom felt as heavy as a lead ballast pig. A terrible shock for the parish," Miss Hartley murmured sympathetically, her eyes roving gently across the orderly room. "And for all of you who relied upon him so completely. In St. Mary Mead, when poor Mr. Harper the carpenter collapsed during the roofing of the new vestry, everyone said it was heart strain, though it turned out later, poor man, that he had been taking a very dangerous patent medicine for his indigestion. But tell me, Captain Ross, are the life jackets kept here in the boathouse?" "Aye, ma'am," Captain Ross replied, nodding toward a large wooden locker beneath the eastern window. The locker was constructed of heavy tongue-and-groove pine, painted Admiralty gray, secured by an ordinary iron hasp and a simple brass padlock. Hanging from a small copper tack, driven directly into the frame beside the hasp, was the key itself. Every man has his own vest, numbered and fitted to his chest, kept under lock and key, according to the institution regulations, though in a volunteer station, where a call might come at 3 in the morning, with the gale screaming through the rafters, we keep the key right there on the nail, so no man's fumbling in his pockets when the maroon goes off." "Very sensible, I'm sure," Miss Hartley said softly. "Where every second counts in saving a human life, one cannot be searching through drawers. And who oversees the inspection of the equipment? Before Captain Ross could answer, the door of the station's small inner office clicked open, and Mr. Reginald Hobbs stepped out into the bay. Hobbs was the station's honorary secretary and treasurer, a post he had occupied with meticulous dedication for 11 years. He was a tall, thin gentleman of 61, dressed with austere precision in a dark gray flannel suit, a stiff wing collar, and a modest black knitted tie. He had silvery hair, parted cleanly down the center, gold-rimmed spectacles that sat high upon a sharp aquiline nose, and a thin, bloodless mouth that seemed perpetually compressed in the contemplation of municipal accounts. In addition to his lifeboat duties, Hobbs served as a churchwarden, a trustee of the Fishermen's Widows Fund, and the secretary of the Trevore Harbor Improvement Committee. He was, by every outward metric, the very model of civic rectitude, a gentleman whose life was an open ledger of selfless administration. "Good morning, Mrs. Vane. Good morning, Miss Hartley," Hobbs said, his voice measured, dry, and polite. He dabbed at his forehead with a neatly folded handkerchief. "A dreadful, unspeakable business. I have just been drafting our preliminary report for the district inspector in Plymouth. We are all quite shattered. Tom Pellegrew was one of our finest." "You must be carrying a very heavy burden of administrative worry, Mr. Hobbs," Miss Hartley remarked with gentle deference. "All the official forms, the inquest arrangements, the equipment records." "The record-keeping is the least I can do for our brave men," Hobbs replied, adjusting his spectacles with a faint, sorrowful smile. He stepped over to the wall beside the office door, where a handsome mahogany cabinet with a glass-fronted door was mounted at eye level. Inside the cabinet, resting upon a green baize shelf, lay a massive, brass-bound volume, bound in dark blue calfskin, its cover embossed in gold, with the RNLI crest. "This is our station service and maintenance log. It contains the continuous history of this station since 1870. Every launch, every gallon of diesel fuel, every overhaul of the winch, every life jacket stitching check, is entered here under date and signature. It is, you might say, the sacred memory of Trevore Point." Miss Hartley looked at the mahogany case. The small brass turn latch on the glass door was unfastened, swinging slightly in the draught from the slipway. "A magnificent volume, Mr. Hobbs, and so conveniently placed for reference." "Indeed," Hobbs said. "We believe in complete transparency here. Any officer or inspector may consult it at a moment's notice." Miss Hartley stepped a little closer to the case. Through the clear glass, she could see the open double-page spread of the current year's ledger. The left-hand page showed the rough, heavy handwriting of the seagoing crew, Captain Ross's thick, blunt pencil notations, recording weather observations and fuel levels, interspersed with the crabbed, grease-smudged penmanship of Arthur Cray, the station's veteran mechanic. But amid those broad, irregular scrawls, Miss Hartley's sharp eyes caught sight of several entries executed in a strikingly different manner. A narrow, precise, copperplate hand, written with a fine-nibbed steel pen in deep blue ink, where every comma was placed with the geometrical exactitude of an accountant's balance sheet. It was an entry of extraordinary neatness, sitting like a manicured garden in the middle of a rocky moor. And as Miss Hartley looked at it, she noticed something that caused a faint, momentary stillness in her knitting fingers. The glass door had no lock whatsoever, and the book, like the life jackets on their peg rail, stood ready for any hand that chose to turn its pages in the dark. Chapter 3. The Mechanic's Initials. By Thursday morning, the inquest had been formally opened in the schoolroom and immediately adjourned by the county coroner, pending the completion of a full medical report from Truro. The village remained wrapped in a cloak of uneasy speculation. Miss Hartley, having secured Captain Ross's genial permission during the morning lull, returned to the lifeboat station, accompanied by her knitting bag. While the coxswain was busy on the slipway, supervising the greasing of the haulage chains, Miss Hartley sat on a wooden bench near the mahogany cabinet, the great service and maintenance log resting open across her lap. With the aid of a small folding magnifying glass she routinely carried in her velvet reticule for examining fine lace, Miss Hartley turned the heavy vellum leaves backward from September through the spring. The log was a fascinating document of maritime routine. There were entries for paint purchased in Penzance, barrels of lubricating oil received from the railhead, replacement wooden rowing pins turned on the local lathe, and quarterly inspections of the auxiliary gear. On the page for March, her glass halted over an entry situated halfway down the right-hand column. 14 March. Quarterly inspection of 12 standard Kapok and Cork lifebelts, pattern B. Canvas sound, webbing ties secure, cork blocks examined for dry rot and buoyancy. All 12 jackets certified in first-class seagoing condition. Signed, A.C. The initials A.C. were written in a hurried, somewhat jerky hand, the ink a faded brownish black that matched the general tone of the spring entries. Miss Hartley stared at those two letters for a long time. The initials A.C. belonged to Arthur Cray, the station's chief mechanic, a taciturn, dour man of 55, who lived alone in a tarred cottage behind the fish-curing sheds, and whose temper had been a matter of common gossip in Trevore Point for 30 years. At that moment, the side door of the engine bay creaked open, and Arthur Cray himself shuffled into the room, carrying a galvanized bucket of tallow and a bundle of greasy cotton waste. He was a wiry, stooped man, with sour gray eyes, a perpetual stubble of iron-gray beard, and hands stained indelible black with motor oil and graphite. Seeing Miss Hartley with the station log upon her knees, Cray stopped short, his brow furrowing into a dark, suspicious knot. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Cray rasped, his voice sounding like gravel being turned with a spade. "That book ain't meant for visitors to be thumbing through. That's station property, that is." "Oh, forgive me, Mr. Cray," Miss Hartley said, with an apologetic flutter of her hands, looking up at him with the wide, harmless innocence of a visiting great-aunt. "Captain Ross was so very kind as to allow me to admire the penmanship. Such a remarkable record of service. I was just observing this entry here for the 14th of March concerning the inspection of the life jackets. It bears your initials, does it not? The capital letters A.C. for Arthur Cray." Arthur Cray's jaw tightened. He set the bucket of tallow down upon the flags with an unnecessary clatter. His eyes darted toward the open office door before fixing upon Miss Hartley with raw hostility. "What about it?" he snapped. "I look after the machinery. If the book says I checked the jackets, then they was checked. What's that got to do with poor Tom drowning?" "Nothing at all, I am sure," Miss Hartley replied mildly, smoothing her skirt. "Only that the canvas and the cork were certified in first-class condition so recently. It must be a great comfort to know that every possible precaution was taken." "Comfort?" Cray spat, wiping his blackened palms on his apron. "There ain't no comfort in this cursed place since Tuesday." Folks whispering in the lanes, looking sideways at a man as if he was to blame for the water taking Tom. Tom Pellegrew was a meddler, if you want the truth of it. Always sticking his nose into the stores, counting up the tins of grease, asking questions about where the scrap copper went from the old engine overhaul. "Mind your own business, Tom," I told him straight, only last Friday in the lugger. And now he's gone and drowned himself, and people are looking at me like I pushed him in. "Did you quarrel with him, Mr. Cray?" Miss Hartley asked, her voice dropping to a confidential, sympathetic whisper. "We had words," Cray said harshly, though a flicker of genuine fear showed behind his truculence. "Men have words every day of the week. That don't mean I wished him harm. But I tell you this, lady, there's things going on in this harbor that won't bear the light of day, and Tom was getting ready to throw a lantern into the dark corners. He told me he'd have the whole committee by the ears before Michaelmas. And what did he mean by that, do you suppose?" Craig turned away abruptly, snatching up his grease rag. "Ask them that wears the collar and writes the letters," he muttered darkly. I'm just the grease monkey, but if you're looking for who handled them vests, you look somewhere else besides me." He stalked off into the engine annex, slamming the heavy iron-studded door behind him, where the sharp rhythmic clinking of spanners against cold steel immediately began, as though he were furiously attempting to dismantle an engine block, merely to drown out the sound of his own racing thoughts and the rising tide of suspicion that threatened to engulf him. Miss Hartley sat very quietly on the bench. She looked down at the entry for 14 March once more. The initials AC were bold and crude, but as she tilted the volume toward the seaward window, she noticed a peculiar discrepancy. The ink of the AC had soaked slightly into the paper, creating tiny feathered edges, whereas the line above it, "All 12 jackets certified in first-class seagoing condition," had been written with a smooth, hard stroke that did not feather at all. It was as though the sentence had been penned on a dry day with good sizing in the paper, while the signature had been added at another time, in a different humidity, or with an entirely different brand of ink. She closed the log, returned it carefully to the mahogany case, and pulled the turn latch shut. A quarrel over missing stores, a man who threatened to expose something at the Michaelmas meeting, and a maintenance entry that did not sit comfortably upon the page. The threads were beginning to emerge, but they were still tangled in the dark. Chapter 4. What the Cork Concealed. The breakthrough came late on Thursday afternoon, not from the police or the Admiralty inspectors, but through the quiet intervention of Miss Hartley herself. Dr. Penrose, the village surgeon, was a weary, conscientious gentleman of 68, who had delivered half the parish and closed the eyes of the other half. He lived in a square Georgian house at the top of the village, where a small side surgery smelled of carbolic acid, ether, and stale tobacco. Miss Hartley, accompanied by Mrs. Vane, called upon him just as the autumn dusk was turning the window panes to violet. "It is the weight, Dr. Penrose," Miss Hartley said softly, accepting a cup of China tea from the doctor's elderly housekeeper. Captain Ross mentioned that when poor Tom was lifted from the seabed, he felt as heavy as an anvil, and Frank Truscott said the same. Now, in St. Mary Mead, when young Willie Cooper fell into the mill pond wearing his heavy winter overcoat, he struggled for a long time because the wool soaked up the water. But a standard RNLI life jacket is filled with solid cork blocks and kapok. Even when soaked, cork has an immense natural buoyancy. A man wearing 12 pounds of cork cannot sink 12 feet to the bottom like a stone, even if he has suffered the most terrible seizure of the heart. Old Mr. Bellingham, who was an inspector of rivercraft on the Thames, once told my father that a man in a cork lifebelt cannot submerge his ears, even if he tries with all his might. Dr. Penrose set down his teacup, his gray eyebrows drawing together in a sharp, troubled line. He looked at Miss Hartley with a sudden, intense concentration. "You know, Miss Hartley," he said slowly, "I have been sitting here at my desk for 2 days with a feeling of profound unease that I could not quite formulate into words. The lungs were full of water, certainly. Death was due to drowning. But when we laid him upon the jetty, before we stripped off his outer gear, his chest was pinned down. I had to use 2 hands to lift the canvas collar away from his neck." "Where's the jacket now, doctor?" Miss Hartley asked. "It is in my side dispensary," Penrose replied, rising from his chair. "Constable Gidley brought it up from the boathouse yesterday for the inquest formalities, and left it in my care. Come through." The 3 of them stepped into the cold, tile-floored dispensary. Laid out upon a zinc examination table beneath a hanging gas lamp was Tom Pellegrew's sea gear, his salt-encrusted guernsey, his blue trousers, and the bulky orange-painted canvas life jacket, stiff with dried brine. The jacket was of the standard Admiralty pattern, a sleeveless vest constructed of heavy sailcloth, divided into vertical canvas pockets, each designed to hold a rectangular block of Portuguese cork measuring 8 inches by 4. Broad web straps with iron buckles were fitted to secure the vest around the ribs and crotch. Miss Hartley approached the table. She reached out with her gloved hand and attempted to lift the vest by its shoulder strap. She could not move it with one hand. It required both of Dr. Penrose's strong arms to raise the jacket from the zinc table. It landed back upon the metal with a heavy, deadening thud. "Good heavens," Dr. Penrose gasped, his face draining of color. "That weighs 40, no, nearly 50 pounds. "Have you a sharp scalpel, Doctor?" Miss Hartley asked quietly. With hands that trembled slightly, Dr. Penrose selected a heavy dissection scalpel from his instrument tray. He slit the coarse linen stitching along the bottom seam of the right-hand breast pocket. He reached inside the canvas envelope and pulled out the internal block. It was not cork. It was a solid block of seasoned English elm, cut and planed to the exact dimensions of a standard cork slab, and painted with a thin wash of brownish-yellow sealant to mimic the hue of natural bark. But when Penrose turned it over in the lamplight, the true horror of the device became manifest. The underside of the wooden block had been hollowed out with a woodcarver's gouge, packed with tightly fitted lead fishing weights, and sealed shut with a mixture of pitch and resin. The wood itself had been steeped in brine until it was completely waterlogged, achieving a specific gravity far greater than seawater. There were 8 pockets in the vest. Every single one contained an identical block of lead-weighted elm. "Merciful God," Dr. Penrose breathed, staggering back against the medicine cabinet. It was an engine of death. The moment he leaped into 12 feet of water, the weight pulled him straight down like a diver's boots. He was trapped in 50 pounds of lead. Miss Hartley leaned over the wooden block, her magnifying glass in hand. She examined the edges of the wood, the tool marks left by the gouge, and the surface of the sealant. "Notice, Doctor," she said in a tone of quiet, sorrowful gravity. "The standard RNLI cork blocks are stamped upon their outer face with the official seal of the institution in blue indelible ink. These wooden blocks bear no stamp whatsoever. Whoever made them had access to seasoned wood, lead shot, and the measurements of the canvas pockets. But he could not forge the official rubber stamp. And look at the stitching on the pocket seam. It was sewn with ordinary waxed cobbler's thread, not the heavy 3-ply hemp used by the station. In St. Mary Mead, when the church roof was repaired, old Mr. Gudgeon used lead clippings from the gutters to weight his duck decoys so they would sit low in the reeds. It is a technique well known to anyone who works with tools in a garden shed. "It was murder," Constance Vane whispered, clutching her throat in horror. "Cold, deliberate, premeditated murder." "Yes," said Miss Hartley, her mild blue eyes darkening with an immense, sorrowful indignation. "A man who went out to save others, sent to the bottom of the sea by a calculated piece of mechanics. But there is something even more terrifying to consider, Doctor. If someone had the opportunity and the malice to alter Tom Pellegrew's jacket in the station locker, how do we know he altered only one?" Chapter 5. The Second Weight. The discovery of the lead-weighted elm blocks transformed the atmosphere in Trevore Point from one of mournful resignation into an icy, suffocating dread. Within an hour of Dr. Penrose's disclosure, Constable Gidley had pedaled furiously up from the cove, his round face flushed with alarm, accompanied by Captain Ross and Mr. Reginald Hobbs. The station boathouse was immediately cleared of curious onlookers and locked from the inside. Outside, the autumn wind was rising, sending long, foamy rollers crashing against the granite slipway, while inside, beneath the cold glare of the hanging incandescent lamps, the crew's gear locker stood open. "I can't believe it, Miss Hartley," Captain Ross said, his voice trembling with a terrible fury. "A man who would tamper with a sea vest, would poison a well, or cut the brake wires on an ambulance. It's the work of a monster." "A monster, certainly," Miss Hartley agreed quietly, standing beside the opened pine locker with her hands folded in her woolen mittens. "Or someone who was driven by a very desperate, very calculated necessity. But we must not delay, Captain Ross. If one vest was transformed into an anchor, we must examine every single jacket hanging in this cupboard this very minute. There were 11 remaining vests in the locker, each hanging from an iron peg beneath the stenciled name of its assigned crewman. Constable Gidley, his notebook clutched awkwardly in his left hand, lifted the first jacket, belonging to young Jago, the bowman. It was light, yielding, and springy. A quick slit of the pocket seam with Dr. Penrose's scalpel revealed a clean, buoyant slab of Portuguese cork, bearing the bright blue RNLI oval stamp. The second vest, belonging to Captain Ross himself, was equally sound. So too were the third, the fourth, and the fifth. Then Captain Ross reached for the sixth jacket, hanging from peg number 4. Above the peg was painted in white letters, Frank Truscott. Frank Truscott was a quiet, steady fisherman of 32, Tom Pellegrew's closest companion at sea, and his regular partner on the trawling grounds. Truscott stood by the workbench, his arms folded across his chest, watching the inspection with an expression of grim, silent bewilderment. Ross took hold of the shoulder straps of Truscott's vest. As he lifted it from the peg, his arms jerked downward with an audible grunt of shock. "Lord above," Ross breathed. "Look at this." He carried the vest to the workbench and laid it down. It did not bend or drape like canvas over cork. It lay stiff, rigid, and heavy as pig iron. Penrose stepped forward with the scalpel. With 3 quick strokes, he sliced open the central breast pocket and the lower flank seams. From inside the canvas casing tumbled 4 more rectangular slabs of elmwood, carved, hollowed, packed with lead shot, and sealed with black pitch. A collective gasp echoed through the granite boathouse. Frank Truscott went as white as a bleached sail. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the heavy wooden block upon the bench. "That was my vest," Truscott whispered, his voice cracking with sheer terror. "I was on the slipway during the drill on Tuesday, working the winch haulage wire, but I was down on the roster to take the stern oar in the second boat next Tuesday morning. I would have put that on. I would have jumped into 20 fathom of water off the Black Dog." "2 men," Captain Ross said, his fists shaking as he struck the workbench. "2 of my crew marked for the bottom. Who in God's name has a feud with both Tom Pellegrew and Frank Truscott?" "It is not a feud, Captain Ross," Miss Hartley said very softly, her eyes resting with deep sorrow upon the lead-filled elm. "When 2 men in the same crew are targeted in the exact same manner, it is rarely because of what they have done to someone else. It is almost always because of what they both knew." She turned her gaze toward Frank Truscott. "Mr. Truscott, when you and Tom were fishing the South Channel last week, did Tom speak to you about his worries? About the numbers he was writing in his black pocketbook?" Frank Truscott swallowed hard. His eyes darted nervously across the room, lingering for a fraction of a second upon the closed door of the secretary's office, where Reginald Hobbs stood leaning against the doorframe, his face pale and his arms tightly folded. Tom told me he'd found something wrong," Truscott stammered. "He was working over at the harbor timber yard on the Michaelmas inventory, checking the delivery dockets against the station receipts. He said there was 300 pounds of copper nails, 40 gallons of marine varnish, and 6 new cork vests, invoiced to the station over the last 18 months, that never came off the railway carts in Truro. He said somebody was billing the institution for first-class gear, and putting scrap into the boats, and pocketing the difference. He said he was going to lay the whole ledger before the district inspector at the quarterly meeting." Truscott's voice broke into a dry, shuddering sob, his calloused hands covering his eyes as the realization washed over him that the sea gear he had trusted with his life had been transformed into an instrument of murder by someone he had known and greeted on the quay every day of his adult life, someone who had sat beside him at harvest suppers and sung hymns in the very same choir stall on Christmas morning. He told me not to breathe a word until he had the final invoices from the railway clerk. He said, "Frank, if I'm right, there's a thief sitting at the top of our table. And if anything happens to me, you go to Plymouth and tell the Admiral." "And you were the only person he told?" Miss Hartley asked gently. "Aye," Truscott whispered, "just me. And now Tom's dead, and my vest was waiting for me on the peg." Miss Hartley nodded slowly. The shape of the tragedy was coming into stark, terrifying clarity. It was not a sudden burst of passion, or a drunken brawl behind the fish sheds. It was the cold, mathematical calculation of a thief who had realized that two men stood between him and total ruin, and who had built two wooden traps in the quiet of his workshop to ensure that the truth stayed at the bottom of the sea. Chapter 6. Hospital Papers. The immediate consequence of Frank Truscott's revelation was a dramatic escalation in official authority. Constable Gidley, having realized that he was dealing with a double conspiracy to murder, placed a telephone call to the County Constabulary headquarters in Bodmin, requesting the immediate dispatch of a senior detective inspector. In the interim, Gidley felt duty-bound to take decisive action against the most obvious suspect. Arthur Cray was summoned to the station office. The mechanic entered with an air of sullen defiance, his greasy cap crumpled in his hands, his sour eyes glaring at Gidley, Ross, and Hobbs. "Now look here, Cray," Constable Gidley said, attempting to sound authoritative as he tapped his pencil against the station log on the desk. "We found 2 sabotaged life vests in that locker. You're the mechanic. You're responsible for the maintenance of the station gear. And right here in this book, on the 14th of March, there's an entry certifying all 12 vests in first-class seagoing condition, signed with your initials, AC. Tom Pellegrew had words with you last Friday about missing stores. You've got access to the workshop, you've got wood-carving tools, and you've got a grudge against every man who ever wore a clean collar. What have you got to say for yourself?" Arthur Cray looked at the constable, then at Captain Ross, and finally at Reginald Hobbs, who sat in the corner with an expression of pained, sorrowful gravity. A strange, harsh laugh rattled in Cray's throat, a sound devoid of mirth, full of bitter contempt. "You're a fool, Gidley," Cray rasped. "You're a great, thick-headed country fool who couldn't find a mackerel in a fish box unless it bit your nose off." "That's enough of that, Cray," Gidley barked, reddening. "Answer the question." "I didn't write that entry," Cray said flatly. "And I didn't check no life jackets on the 14th of March. Your initials are in the book. Then somebody put 'em there who had a mind to make me take the blame." Cray thrust his blackened hand deep into his greasy coat pocket and pulled out a battered, oil-stained leather wallet. With trembling fingers, he extracted 2 folded sheets of printed paper, creased and yellowed at the edges, and slapped them down upon the open ledger. "Read that, Constable. Go on, read it out loud so the captain can hear it." Gidley picked up the papers, his brow furrowing as he adjusted them to the light. Miss Hartley, leaning over the back of the chair, looked at the documents with her keen, mild eyes. They were official medical discharge certificates from the Royal Cornwall Infirmary in Truro. Patient, Arthur Cray. Admitted, 12 March. Emergency surgical procedure, appendectomy. Discharged, 17 March. Certified unfit for manual labor until 1 April. I was laid out on a hospital cot in Truro from the Tuesday to the Sunday, with a drainage tube in my belly and 3 nurses feeding me beef tea, Cray said, his voice shaking with fierce vindication. I wasn't within 25 miles of Trevore Point on the 14th of March. Captain Ross knows I was away sick. He had young Penhaligon oiling the winch chains all that week. Captain Ross stared at the certificates, then slapped his forehead with the palm of his hand. Good God, Arthur. He's right. I remember now. You were in Truro having your appendix out. I sent you 5 shillings from the crew tobacco fund on the Wednesday morning. Constable Gidley sat back in his chair, his mouth slightly open, the pencil slipping from his fingers. Then who wrote AC in the station log? Someone who knew Arthur's initials, Miss Hartley said softly, and who knew that Arthur was the person who ought to have performed the quarterly inspection. But someone who forgot, in the hurry of fabricating a false record, that Arthur was in Truro on that particular date. She looked at the signature, AC, once more. In St. Mary Mead, our dear old postmaster, Mr. Badger, was once accused of having abstracted £5 notes from registered letters, because his initials appeared upon the counterfoils on the days the money disappeared. Everyone was ready to send the poor man to the assizes, but it was discovered that the junior clerk, who had a great weakness for betting on greyhounds, had simply scribbled Mr. Badger's initials upon the receipts whenever Mr. Badger was away, attending his sister's funeral in Bournemouth. It is so very easy to forge two simple capital letters, but exceedingly difficult to forge an entire life. Arthur Cray snatched back his hospital papers and stuffed them into his wallet. "I told you there was rottenness here," he snarled, glaring at the room. "And whoever put my name in that book didn't just want Tom dead, he wanted me to hang for it." He turned on his heel and marched out of the office, slamming the outer door so hard that the brass diving helmets on the wall chimed like bells. The room fell into an uncomfortable, brooding silence. The obvious suspect had been completely, unassailably cleared. The false lead had collapsed, leaving the investigation face to face with an uncomfortable truth. The murderer was not an uneducated mechanic working in a fit of rage, but an educated man who had access to the station's official records, who knew how to mimic administrative entries, and who moved through the village with an air of untouchable respectability. Chapter 7. The September Entry. On Friday morning, Miss Hartley sat alone at the small mahogany table in the bay window of Highcliffe Cottage. Outside, the Atlantic was throwing great sheets of grey spray over the outer harbour wall, the gulls crying shrilly as they banked against the wind. Spread out before her were 3 sheets of ordinary household blotting paper, a small pair of brass calipers, her lace inspection magnifying glass, and a sheaf of handwritten documents she had quietly borrowed from various community archives over the preceding 24 hours. There was a copy of the parish council minutes from July, the audited accounts of the Trevore Fishermen's Widows' Fund, a list of donors for the church roof restoration fund, and several handwritten receipts from the local coal merchant. Every one of these documents bore the signature or the annotations of Mr. Reginald Hobbs. Miss Hartley picked up her magnifying glass and examined Hobbs's handwriting with the patient, methodical concentration of a scholar deciphering an ancient manuscript. Hobbs wrote with a characteristic Victorian clerk's hand, erect, disciplined, and remarkably consistent. His capital E's were formed with a double loop at the center. His lowercase t's were crossed with a short horizontal bar that lifted slightly at the right-hand tip. And his numbers were notable for one peculiar, indelible idiosyncrasy. Whenever he wrote a date, he never used a hyphen or an oblique stroke to separate the day, month, and year. He invariably used a small, neat dot, placed precisely halfway up the height of the numeral, 3.9.52. Furthermore, Miss Hartley noticed that in all his official correspondence, Hobbs used an imported German bone folder to press down his folds, leaving a faint, glossy burnish along the margins of the paper. Miss Hartley laid down the church accounts and closed her eyes. She visualized the large blue calfskin volume in the mahogany cabinet at the lifeboat station. She recalled the entry she had observed on her first visit, that island of exquisite neatness among the grease-stained scrawls of Captain Ross and Arthur Cray. An hour later, wrapped securely in her heavy tweed ulster, her thick woolen scarf, and her stout galoshes, Miss Hartley walked down the cliff lane to the lifeboat station. The boathouse was deserted. Captain Ross had gone to the railway station at St. Austell to meet the detective inspector arriving on the noon train, and Constable Gidley was at the village hall taking a formal statement from Frank Truscott. The great hall was quiet, save for the rhythmic slap-slap of the rising tide against the slipway doors, and the occasional drip of moisture from the lifeboat's hull. Miss Hartley walked directly to the mahogany cabinet beside the office door. She turned the small brass latch, swung open the glass door, and lifted the heavy service and maintenance log from its baize shelf. She carried the volume to the large seaward window, where the cold, clear northern light poured across the vellum pages. She turned to the page for September. There, situated 3 lines from the bottom of the right-hand page, immediately preceding the record of the fatal Tuesday drill, was an entry she had noted before. 3.9.52. Routine pre-drill overhaul of all emergency sea gear. Canvas pockets examined for wear. Web harness straps inspected. 12 standard Cork buoyancy units tested and certified in perfect operational readiness. R.H. Honorary Secretary. Miss Hartley brought her magnifying glass close to the paper. Under the 10-power lens, the microstructure of the ink and the paper revealed its secrets with startling clarity. First, the ink. The preceding entries on the page, recording fuel deliveries on 28 August and winch repairs on 1 September, had been written in a heavy, carbon-black iron gall ink that had oxidized into a deep brownish black. But the entry for 3 September had been written in a modern, aniline-dyed royal blue ink, a bright, clean blue that showed no trace of oxidation whatsoever. Second, the pen. The black entries had been made with a broad, flexible brass nib that left wide downstrokes and heavy crossbars. The 3 September entry had been penned with an exceptionally stiff, extra-fine steel nib, producing hairlines of surgical precision. Third, and most damning of all, Miss Hartley shifted the angle of the magnifying glass so that the raking window light struck the surface of the paper. The entry for 3 September had not been written upon a fresh, clean surface. Beneath the royal blue words, all 12 standard Cork buoyancy units tested, there were microscopic, faint indentations in the vellum where an earlier entry had been erased. The sizing of the paper had been slightly abraded by a sharp steel ink eraser, and then smoothed down with a bone folder before the new blue ink was applied. And looking closely at the faint ghostly traces left in the fibers of the page, Miss Hartley could just make out the original pencil notation that had been scrubbed away. Tom P. queried invoice 418, awaiting vouchers. Miss Hartley held her breath. It was all there. Tom Pellegrew had come into this office on the 3rd of September, had opened this very book, and had noted that invoice number 418 for replacement equipment was suspect. Reginald Hobbs had seen that notation. He had known that within days Tom would have the supporting vouchers from the railway depot in Truro. He had taken his ink eraser, had scraped Tom's warning pencil mark from the page, and had written in its place a neat, formal certification that all 12 jackets were in perfect operational readiness. A certification designed to prove, after Tom was dead, that the equipment had been officially checked and found sound, thereby cementing the illusion of a freak medical accident. And to ensure that the blame would fall elsewhere if anyone ever looked into the jackets themselves, Hobbs had gone back to the March page and inserted Arthur Cray's initials, AC, above the spring check, completely unaware that Cray had been lying in a hospital bed in Truro with an appendectomy. Miss Hartley closed the great leather logbook. Her hands were perfectly steady, but her heart was heavy with a profound, sorrowful anger. The trap was built of ink, paper, and 40 pounds of lead. But paper, Miss Hartley knew, has a terrible, enduring memory. It remembers every scratch of the eraser, every shade of ink, and every lie written upon its face. Chapter 8. The Harbourmaster's Book. The gathering of the final external evidence occupied the early hours of Friday afternoon. The walk along the quay from the boathouse to the Harbourmaster's tower was less than 200 yards. But to Miss Hartley and Mrs. Constance Vane, it represented a journey through the living history of Cornish maritime commerce. Along the granite seawall, heavy cast-iron bollards, polished to a dull silver sheen by the friction of 1,000 mooring hawsers, stood like low iron pillars against the tide. The air was thick with the scent of oak sawdust from the boat-builder's shed, wet seaweed drying on the slipway stones, and the sharp, clean aroma of wood tar from the caulking pots. 2 coal brigs from Cardiff were discharging Welsh anthracite at the outer pier, their steam winches hissing and rattling as the iron buckets swung ashore. In such an active working port, goods of every description were constantly being unloaded, shifted, weighed, and entered into ledgers. And it was precisely within that ceaseless movement of cargo that a clever, patient man had found the means to hide 11 years of systematic theft. The Harbourmaster's office itself was a squat octagonal stone tower that had stood at the entrance of Trevore Haven since the reign of King William IV. Captain Trelaw, the Harbourmaster, was an affable, elderly mariner with a white beard trimmed like a nautical hedge, a brass telescope under his arm, and an encyclopedic knowledge of every barrel of salt and ton of coal that had entered the port since 1890. "Ah, Mrs. Vane and Miss Hartley," Trelaw said warmly, welcoming them into his circular room where maritime charts covered the walls and the smell of plugged tobacco mingled with the briny tang of the harbor. "A sad day for our little town. Terrible business about Tom Pellegrew. The whole cove feels like a ship that's lost her rudder." "It is a tragedy that touches every heart, Captain Trelaw," Miss Hartley said gently, resting her umbrella against a brass binnacle. "We were speaking earlier with dear Mr. Prendick Hobbs about the immense volume of supplies required to keep our brave station in readiness. Such an enormous quantity of heavy gear. Manila cordage, copper bolts, seasoned timber, and life-saving buoyancy units. I suppose all such goods arriving by sea or rail must pass through your harbor customs registers." "Every blessed ounce, ma'am," Captain Trelaw replied proudly, tapping the leather-bound ledger resting upon his high-standing desk. "Under the Harbor Act of 1888, no commercial freight can be discharged on this quay or delivered from the Great Western Railway Depot without an entry in my manifest and a signed receipt from the consignee." "How wonderfully thorough," Miss Hartley murmured, tilting her head. "I wonder, would it be an unpardonable imposition if we were to glance at the delivery entries for the lifeboat station over the past 2 years? You see, the Ladies' Auxiliary is preparing a small commemorative account of the station's expenses for the parish magazine, and dear Mr. Hobbs has been so dreadfully overwhelmed with the inquest papers that we felt it our Christian duty to save him the labor." "Imposition? Not in the least, Miss Hartley," Trelaw said with a hearty chuckle, "always happy to assist the church ladies. Here, let's pull down the goods manifests for 51 and 52. For 45 minutes, Miss Hartley's magnifying glass traced the columns of the harbor registers, comparing the freight entries against a handwritten list of requisition vouchers she had noted from the station accounts. The discrepancy was staggering in its simplicity and brazen in its execution. According to the station's audited balance sheets, presented annually to the Royal National Lifeboat Institution by Mr. Reginald Hobbs, the Trevore Point station had purchased and paid for 6 dozen first-grade Portuguese cork buoyancy blocks from a marine outfitter in Bristol, 800 weight of pure copper fastenings from a foundry in Birmingham, and 400 yards of 4-inch Italian hemp hawser. The total expenditure, recorded in the station's official ledger, amounted to £1,420 sterling over 11 years. According to Captain Trelaw's official harbor manifest, not one single shipment from the Bristol Cork outfitter had ever arrived at Trevore Haven. Instead, the manifest showed that on 3 separate dates in November 1950, August 1951, and March 1952, Mr. Reginald Hobbs had personally signed for shipments of cheap, second-hand scrap timber from a demolition yard in Plymouth, several sacks of lead scrapings from a plumber's merchant in Truro, and 3 barrels of common tar pitch. The cost of the scrap timber and lead, £14, 6 shillings. The amount billed to the Lifeboat Institution, £380. Hobbs had systematically embezzled over £1,200 from the Volunteer Lifeboat Fund, using a portion of the stolen money to purchase worthless scrap materials, which he then secretly fashioned into dummy equipment to keep the station's storage lockers visually full during routine inspections. "Look at this, Judith," Constance whispered in horror, pointing a trembling finger at an entry for 26 August. Hobbs personally collected 2 sacks of lead shot from the Truro carrier, signed in his own name. Lead shot, the very material used to weight Tom Pellegrew's jacket. "Yes," Miss Hartley said, her voice quiet and very cold. "And look at the date. August 26th, exactly 3 weeks before the annual launch drill. That was the week Tom Pellegrew began checking the timber yard dockets." Miss Hartley closed the harbor ledger and thanked Captain Trelawney with her customary sweetness. But as she stepped back onto the granite quay, she turned toward the lifeboat station at the end of the lane. "Martha said it was stolen from his sea chest. A thief who steals an incriminating document from a cottage parlor does not carry it home to his own house, where his wife or maid might find it," Miss Hartley remarked, walking with brisk, purposeful steps. "Nor does he burn it immediately, because he must first examine it to see exactly how much his accuser knew and whether any other person was named in its pages. He hides it in the one place where he has complete privacy, total authority, and a locked drawer." They entered the lifeboat station. The outer bay was still empty. Miss Hartley walked straight into the inner secretary's office. Behind the mahogany desk stood a tall Victorian filing cabinet with 4 deep drawers. The top drawer was locked with a small brass key. Miss Hartley produced from her reticule the small, sturdy steel hairpin she had carried for 40 years. With a gentle, practiced twist that would have earned the admiration of any locksmith in London, the tumblers clicked smoothly back. Inside the drawer, tucked beneath a stack of blank RNLI donation certificates, lay a small, oilcloth-covered black notebook. Miss Hartley opened the notebook. There, in Tom Pellegrew's rough, laborious, but utterly meticulous handwriting, was a complete chronological exposure of Reginald Hobbs's 11-year fraud. Every fake invoice number was listed, every forged delivery docket was cross-referenced, and on the final page, written in heavy pencil only 4 days before his death, was a single, devastating sentence. "Spoke to R.H. in office. He offered me £50 to burn this book. Told him I'd rather drown than take a thief's bribe. Meeting with District Inspector next Tuesday after the drill." Miss Hartley closed the notebook and placed it securely in her reticule. "He told Hobbs he would rather drown," Miss Hartley whispered, her eyes filling with tears of sorrow and reverence for the fallen fisherman, and Hobbs took him at his word. Chapter 9. The Treasurer's Office. At 6 o'clock that evening, the autumn twilight had settled over Trevore Point in deep indigo shadows. The church bells of St. Piran were chiming for the Friday evening evensong, calling the villagers up the hill to prayer. In the small secretary's office at the back of the lifeboat station, a single brass reading lamp, with a green glass shade, cast a pool of warm amber light across the mahogany desk. Mr. Reginald Hobbs sat in his high-backed leather armchair, a cup of black coffee at his elbow, carefully blotting a column of figures in the newly prepared quarterly summary. He looked up with a start as the door opened, and Miss Judith Hartley stepped quietly into the room. She wore her dark gray woolen cape and her lace-trimmed bonnet, her hands resting calmly upon the curved handle of her umbrella. "Good evening, Mr. Hobbs," Miss Hartley said, her voice soft, polite, and completely devoid of hostility. Hobbs blinked, adjusting his gold-rimmed spectacles. "Ah, Miss Hartley, you startled me. I was just finishing our quarterly report for the district inspector. Is there something I can do for you before I lock up for the night?" "I have come to return something to you, Mr. Hobbs," Miss Hartley replied. She walked forward to the desk. She reached into her reticule, and laid 3 objects down upon the green leather blotter, directly in front of the treasurer. The first was the small block of hollowed lead-weighted elm from Tom Pellegrew's life jacket. The second was the page transcribed from Captain Treloar's Harbour Manifest, showing the delivery of lead shot on 26 August. The third was Tom Pellegrew's black oilcloth pocketbook. Reginald Hobbs did not move. He did not cry out. He did not leap from his chair. A terrible, unnatural stillness settled over him. The color drained from his face with the slow, inexorable finality of sand running through an hourglass, leaving his skin the color of wet chalk. His thin mouth parted slightly, but no sound emerged. His eyes, magnified behind the thick lenses of his spectacles, remained fixed upon the battered black notebook. "It is all over, Mr. Hobbs," Miss Hartley said gently, taking a chair opposite the desk without waiting to be asked. "Inspector Craddock has arrived from Bodmin, and is at this moment with Captain Ross and Dr. Penrose at the police station. But I felt it was right. I felt it was only merciful that someone should speak to you quietly, as one human soul to another, before the law takes its course." Hobbs's hands began to tremble. Slowly, almost mechanically, he removed his spectacles and set them down beside his coffee cup. Without them his face looked old, frail, and utterly stripped of its imposing civic dignity. How long have you known?" he whispered, his voice dry as parched leaves. "I knew that Arthur Cray could not have signed the March inspection the moment I learned he was in Truro Infirmary," Miss Hartley said. "And when I examined the entry for the 3rd of September with my magnifying glass, I saw your own handwriting, the royal blue ink, the stiff steel nib, and the little dots between the numerals 3.9.52 that you use in all your church accounts. You had erased Tom Pellegrew's pencil note about invoice number 418, and written a certification of the life jackets over the erasure, hoping that if anyone examined the book after Tom drowned, it would appear that the equipment had been officially tested and certified sound." Hobbs buried his face in his hands. A long, shuddering sigh escaped his thin chest. 11 years, Miss Hartley," he murmured, his voice muffled by his palms. 11 years of being the man everyone trusted, the churchwarden, the treasurer, the man who never took a penny of salary. "When my brother's shipping agency in Bristol collapsed in 1941, I was left with £6,000 of family debts. If the bankruptcy had become public, I would have been stripped of every office I held. I would have been cast out of society like a leper." He lowered his hands, looking at Miss Hartley with eyes full of haunting, incurable despair. "I only intended to take £50, he said, speaking in the flat, toneless voice of a man reciting an ancient, inescapable tragedy. "Just £50 to pay the half-yearly interest on the Bristol mortgage. I told myself I would repay it when my mother's estate was settled. But the estate yielded nothing. The interest came due again. And then, the system was so terribly easy. No one ever checked the station dockets. They trusted me. The institution in London sent the quarterly checks. I deposited them in the bank. I paid the local suppliers for scrap, and I kept the difference. It became a habit, a routine as ordinary as winding the hall clock." "And then Tom Pellegrew looked into the timber yard dockets," Miss Hartley prompted softly. "Tom was a good man," Hobbs whispered, a tear escaping his eye and rolling down his hollow cheek. "A good, honest, stubborn man. He came to this office 3 weeks ago. He had the railway delivery receipts in his hand. He sat where you are sitting now. He said, 'Mr. Hobbs, there's £300 missing from the gear account. You've got 4 days to put it right before the district inspector comes, or I'm taking the book to the captain.' I offered him money. I begged him on my knees. I told him it would kill my sister. He just looked at me with those hard, honest eyes, and said he'd rather drown than take a thief's shilling." Hobbs shuddered, clutching the edge of the mahogany desk. He said he'd rather drown. The words stayed in my head like an evil chant. Every night I woke up hearing him say it. I'd rather drown. And the launch drill was scheduled for Tuesday. "So you made the blocks," Miss Hartley said. "I have a wood lathe in my garden shed," Hobbs said, his voice sinking to a bare whisper. "I bought the elm logs from the sawmill. I hollowed them out with my gouges. I melted the lead shot on my workshop stove and poured it into the cavities. It took me 12 nights of work, working by candlelight after midnight while my sister slept upstairs. I came down here on Monday evening, after Arthur Cray had locked the boathouse. The key to the gear locker was on the nail. I took Tom's vest from peg 7. I slit the bottom seams, pulled out the cork, inserted the elm, and stitched it closed with black cobbler's wax." "And Frank Truscott's vest?" Miss Hartley asked. Hobbs flinched as though struck by a whip. Tom had told me that Frank knew. He said, "If anything happens to me before Tuesday, Frank has the duplicates." I couldn't stop. Do you understand, Miss Hartley? Once you begin, you cannot stop. The lie demands another lie, and the first death demands a second. If Frank took the stern oar on the next launch, he would go down too, and the secret would be buried forever in 20 fathoms of water. He bowed his head, resting his forehead against the cool mahogany desk. "I am so tired," he whispered. "For 11 years, I have been smiling at neighbors on the quay, taking the collection plate in church, and waiting every single day for the knock upon the door. The waiting was worse than the crime. God help me, the waiting was worse than the crime." Miss Hartley sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, the church bells of St. Piran had ceased their ringing, and the great roar of the Atlantic tide filled the dark harbor with a sound like rolling thunder. "In St. Mary Mead," Miss Hartley said with deep, quiet compassion, "there was a respectable solicitor named Mr. Walcan Heatherick, who spent 20 years protecting a fraudulent deed that his father had forged to save an old estate. He was not a wicked man at heart, but he believed that his reputation was more precious than the truth, and to save his reputation, he destroyed 3 innocent lives. It is a terrible mistake people make, Mr. Hobbs, to imagine that an honorable name is something that can be preserved by committing a dishonorable deed. A good name built upon a lie is like a house built upon sand. The first high tide will wash it into the sea." She rose from her chair, drawing her woolen cape around her shoulders. "The police are outside, Mr. Hobbs," she said gently. "It is time to go." Reginald Hobbs lifted his head. He looked at the station service and maintenance log, resting in its mahogany case upon the wall. Then, with a slow, dignified composure that seemed born of absolute defeat, he stood up, put on his overcoat, and walked toward the door. Chapter 10. The Last Entry. The arrest of Reginald Hobbs sent a shockwave through the county of Cornwall that was felt far beyond the narrow cliffs of Trevore Point. On Saturday morning, while the sea lay gray and quiet under a pale autumn sun, the village gathered on the slipway to pay their final respects to Tom Pellegrew. His coffin, draped in the blue and white flag of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, was carried down to the churchyard by 6 of his fellow crewmen, with Captain Ross and Frank Truscott walking at the head. Behind the coffin walked Martha Pellegrew, her 3 children holding her hands, her head held high in the quiet, unassailable pride of a woman whose husband had died defending the honor of the service he loved. That afternoon, Miss Hartley sat in the sitting room of Highcliffe Cottage, her traveling valise packed and standing by the door. Constance Vane handed her a steaming cup of tea, looking down at the busy harbor below, where the lifeboat crew was already engaged in refitting every single life jacket with freshly stamped, certified cork from Plymouth. "It still seems like a dreadful nightmare, Judith," Constance said softly. "To think that a gentleman we have known for 20 years, a churchwarden, a trustee, a man who gave so much to our community, could do such a monstrous thing." Human nature, Constance dear, is very much the same everywhere, Miss Hartley remarked, her knitting needles moving with gentle, rhythmic ease. People so often imagine that great crimes are committed by strange, monstrous individuals with wicked faces and dark cloaks. But in reality, they are almost always committed by ordinary, respectable people who took one small, dishonest step many years ago and found that they could not turn back. Vanity is a very dangerous master. Mr. Hobbs could not bear the thought of being seen as a failed man, and so he allowed himself to become a murderer. She looked out across the sunlit water of Trevore Cove, where the gulls were wheeling in white arcs against the sky. And yet, Miss Hartley added softly, the truth always leaves its mark. A man may build 50 pounds of lead into a canvas vest, and he may tell 50 lies to his neighbors, but he cannot force the paper in a ledger to forget what was written upon it. The ink, the eraser, the dates, the numbers, they are silent witnesses that outlive all our pretenses. In the end, it was the station's own book that brought justice to Tom Pellegrin. Constance smiled, placing her hand gently upon Miss Hartley's arm. Trevore Point will never forget what you have done for us, Judith. I did very little, Constance, Miss Hartley said with a modest smile. I merely noticed what was already there for anyone to see. It is so very easy to be dazzled by the grand reputation of a man or a building, and so difficult to look at the small, uncomfortable marks in the ink. But when one has lived as long as I have in St. Mary Mead, one learns that the truth is never truly hidden. It is only waiting for someone who is not afraid of finding it out, and who understands that human hearts are fragile, deceitful things that need the quiet light of day to keep them from rot. And so, the book at Trevore Point was closed. The false entries struck through with red ink, and the memory of an honest man restored to the place of honor where it belonged. It is a story that stays with you, isn't it? The thought that the most dangerous deceptions are not the ones that arrive with threats and violence, but the ones that sit quietly in the back of an office, wearing a respectable suit and writing with a fine-tipped pen. I want to return to the question I asked you at the very beginning of tonight's journey. Have you ever known an institution or a person whose public reputation was so towering that nobody dared to question the cracks appearing underneath? Drop your thoughts into the comments. I read every single one, and I always look forward to seeing the wisdom and personal stories you bring to our little gathering. If Midnight Pages has become a peaceful refuge for you, a place where you can pull up a chair, leave the noise of the day behind, and lose yourself in a classic, unhurried mystery, I would be truly honored if you would subscribe to the channel and share this evening's story with a friend who appreciates a good tale well told. There are many more mysteries waiting in the archives, and more quiet hours to share together. This is David, bidding you a very good night from Ohio. Whatever heavy burdens you may be carrying this evening, may you find a safe harbor, and may the truth always keep you afloat.